dear lecturers, students, and guests, allow me, as the rector of the University of National and World Economy, to greet Professor Pol Krugman. Winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, with the heartily and hospitable welcome to the University of National and World Economy. I am confident that as an academic person he feels as one of us. At the Presidium, except Professor Krugman, there are also Professor Borislav Borisov, Honorary Rector and Chairman of the Trustees Council of the University of National and World Economy, Dr. Tsvetan Vasilev, alumnus of UNWE and member of the Trustees Council of the University, Professor Blagoy Kolev, the Ombudsman of the University, Professor Margarita Tanasova, Deputy Chairman of the General Assembly of the University, Professor Violeta Tsakova, the Chairman of the Supervising University Committee, and of course the Chairman of the Student Council, Mr. Antoine Schotter. The occasion of Professor Krugman for being our dear guest today is the academic ceremony on awarding the honorary title of Doctor Honoris Causa of University of National and World Economy to him by the Academic Council decision. Our speaker, Professor Krugman, is one of the famous and worldwide known economists of our time, having won in 2008 Nobel Prize in Economics for his groundbreaking work on international trade and economic geography. He also is well known as a regular op-ed columnist for the New York Times, where he speaks the truth as he sees it in the most compelling terms, in addition to the Nobel Prize. Professor Krugman was also awarded the American Economic Association's John Bates Clark Medal for his work on international trade. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books, including most recently End This Depression Now. His previous books include The Great Unraveling, a New York Times bestseller, and an update of his prescient 1999 book, The Return of Depression Economics, titled The Return of Depression Economics and the Crisis of 2008. Professor Krugman is Professor of Economics at Princeton University, the university with no need to be presented. Professor Pol Kruгman's awarding by the honorary title of Doctor Honoris Causa of UNWE is based on the Academic Council Decision Number 3 of July 3rd, 2013, with the following motives. The Academic Council of University of National and World Economy Sofia confers the honorary title of Doctor Honoris Causa on Professor Pol Kruгman, winner of Nobel Prize on Economics, for significant contribution to the development of economic theory and university education. Dear Professor Krugman, I have the high honor to bestow on you a role in the Latin and Old Bulgarian language and honorary mark, the academic regalia of the honorary title of Doctor Honoris Causa of University of National and World Economy. So, being now in front of me, I'll transfer these regalia to you. This is the old tradition. What happened here? Help me. Professors are needed. Aha. It is written up in Latin and down in Old Slavonic language that we are awarding Professor Pol Krugman the honorary title Doctor Honoris Causa of University of National and World Economy. Also, this is the sign, university sign with a label, and on this label is written, the Academic Council of UNW Sofia confers the honorary title of Doctor Honoris Causa to Professor Pol Krugman. His contribution to the development of economic theory and university education. November 12, 2013. Director, Professor Stafford. According to the academic tradition, each Doctor Honoris Causa of University of National and World Economy delivers an academic speech. Before I give the floor to Professor Krugman, I would kindly like to convey his request not to be made recordings and photos in the hall during his lecture. The floor is yours, Professor Krugman.
Technology can sometimes be a hindrance, but not appearing. Well, then I have nothing to say. No. That's okay. We'll manage. Unable to make it function? I'm going to give it one more. All right. You know what? It would be better if we could. Here. You know what? I think I can start talking, and we'll see if we get this working or not. See, what happened there is that by threatening to speak without the computer, I scared the computer into it realized it could stop. It had to stop and let me go ahead. So my apologies, of course, for speaking in English, and that it's always a problem. I'm raised in the United States and therefore speak at most one language. It's a great honor to receive this degree. Great honor to visit this country and this university. It's particularly, I find myself always very glad to visit a part, what I guess one could say is still, in some respect, a new part of Europe. This is Bulgaria. I'm well aware it's one of the last wave of entrance into the European Union. And it is, as I know, it is the poorest nation in the European Union. We hope that will continue. In the end, we hope for much better times. And I'm going to devote most of this talk to the problems of Europe. And I think it's always important as an American when I do such things, to explain that this comes not out of any negative views about Europe or the European Union. There was some, as you all know, recently the Nobel Peace Prize Committee gave the prize to the European Union. And some people said, what is this about, especially with Europe in so much trouble? But I actually think they were right. The European Union has been one of the great forces for good in today's world. It has taken what is a continent with a terrible history of war, a history of tyranny, made it a place of peace, made it a place of democracy for the most part. It's not always easy. Sometimes one needs to guard against backsliding on democracy. And altogether, it has been an enormously positive development. But also, of course, in such things, intentions are not good enough. Having the desire to do the right thing, which I believe Europe has always had, is not always enough to ensure good results. And if you mess up the technical aspects, if you do the wrong thing in terms of the economics, even if you do it with the best of intentions, then you can have a lot of trouble. And so that, in effect, is what has happened to Europe right now. We have a grand project, a noble project, if you like, the creation of the single currency, which has now turned into a disaster of implementation. Hopefully it can be fixed, but it's going to take a lot of work, and I think it's important to discuss what has actually gone wrong here in Europe. Bit more about the background. The story, the European story, is an unusual one. It's something I think has never been tried really before in history, which is to try and build a growing degree of political unification based in part upon general shared values of democracy, values of openness, but also on economics. The idea was always that you would use growing economic ties to foster growing closeness, to foster a community. So it actually began as an economic community, then it became the community, now it's called the Union. Really, as it begins more than 60 years ago with the coal and steel agreement between Germany and France, which was two things. First, it was an attempt to make sure that the industry of the two countries was so interlinked that they could never again fight a war, and also to create economic growth that would itself be a force for peace. From there, you moved to the common market. From there, one moved to the expansion of the European community. From there, one moved to the Single European Act, which eliminated many of the remaining obstacles to trade, eliminated many of the remaining obstacles to movement of people. And then came one more thing, which was supposed to be a great idea, which was the single currency. And unfortunately, that was not a great idea, at least not yet. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Single currency came into existence officially in 1999. Of course, in reality, there were still francs and marks and lira in circulation for 2 more years. Then came the euro notes, and so now we have the single currency. Bulgaria not part of it, although shadowing. It seemed to work very well for 8 years. But then everything seemed to work well everywhere for 8 years because we had a boom in much of the world. And then came the economic crisis. And the trouble with economic crises is then all of the weaknesses in your system become visible. Now, we hope somehow. Just to say, the crisis has been a terrible thing everywhere. And this very much includes my own country. So when I do not intend to be the ugly Americans saying, oh, we know what we're doing, why don't you be like us? We have actually made a mess of it. And in some ways, with less justification. Because we have all of the structure we need to deal with it. We have a single government. We have I'll talk about those, but we have everything that we need in terms of institutions to have dealt with this crisis effectively, and we did not. So what this actually shows, Fred, that's not my friend, a guy named Fred, that's the Federal Reserve economic data. It's very useful for the United States. The United States used to have almost no long-term unemployment. Almost no one was out of work for more than 6 months. If you look at that, before the crisis, there were 1 million people in the United States who had been out of work for more than 6 months. That's essentially nobody in a country of 300 million people. That's essentially nothing. People lost jobs all the time in the United States, but they could always find one again quickly. Maybe not as good a job. We did not have much long-term unemployment. Now, even after what we like to call an economic recovery, it's more than 4 million. So we're doing very badly. Very slow recovery, but still some kind of recovery. Not so much in Europe. So if you look at unemployment rate, the United States, the unemployment rate has come down. It's still high. Those of you who are actually economists looking at these things know that some of that improvement in the United States reflects a decline in the labor force rather than more jobs, but still some gradual improvement. Europe, no. These are actually European Commission projections out to 2015. So even the people at the European Commission in Brussels, who are supposed to believe in their policies, believe that European unemployment will make essentially no progress even 2 years from now. That's a policy disaster. It's a very uneven disaster. Germany has low unemployment. Spain and Greece have unemployment in excess of 25%. Portugal, 18. Ireland, 13. So it's a story of extreme, of really of 1930s level unemployment in part of Europe. Obviously a very, very bad situation. So how did this happen? How did all of that? Oh, and you can see, by the way, that the euro is introduced in 1999. Things are pretty good for up through 2007. So this was not it was a period of great improvement. Then everything went bad. All right. So what happened? First thing to say is that the kind of problem that we all have is one that is difficult to deal with. Having a financial crisis of the kind that we just experienced is now, it's hard to believe how long this has gone on. Some of us think of the financial crisis as just the other day, but it's worth remembering that the recession began almost 6 years ago. That the fall of Lehman Brothers, which is the moment when it became a high-speed crisis, when it turned into a hyper-crisis, is more than 5 years ago. The collapse of the housing market, both in the United States and in Southern Europe, is 6 years ago. So we have this is actually now this has almost become the normal, is to have this world of a very depressed economy. In any case, inherently dealing with this kind of crisis is hard. Not so much that you don't have the tools as that you have to think in unusual ways. I'll explain that in a moment. So it probably would have been hard even under the best of circumstances. We did not have the best of circumstances. We had an amazing amount of bad economic ideas influencing policy, both sides of the Atlantic. But I would say perhaps worse on this side, worse in Europe than in the United States, although God knows the United States has plenty of bad economic ideas. And finally, Europe was just not ready to really, the single currency came too soon. I guess I should say that, right? My view is I would like to imagine that in time, in the year 2025, Europe will have one currency, it will flourish with one currency. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done and has not been done so far. I'm going to use the U.S. picture because it gives you an idea of what we have. And this is, I like the chart just because I like to have sort of standing behind me something that talks about what we're looking at. But this is This number is, it's one measure, but I think it's actually a pretty good indication of what happens. This is, for the United States, debt, household debt, debts of people, relative to income. Let's see what happened. We came out of World War II with very little household debt. People couldn't borrow during the war. They had very high incomes during the war because of all of the wartime spending. There had been some inflation. Debt was very low. It ramped up a bit. This chart actually happens to begin almost exactly when I was born. So about the time I was born, people were buying houses in the suburbs. One of those houses I grew up in. So there was some increase in debt, but that was healthy. That was fine. Then, beginning around 1980, something else began to happen. And what began to happen? Partly it was deregulation. Restrictions on banks were lifted, all kinds of restrictions, but there was generally became much easier to make loans, became easier to run a bank with not very much capital, not very much reserves. Probably broader than that, though. What happened was it had the memory of really bad times receded. The Great Depression, the 1930s, became something that people only read about in books, not something they remembered, not something that was in their bones. And so they became relaxed about debt. They got more and more relaxed because year after year went by, and in general, the more you borrowed, the better you did. If you were a homeowner, you bought a house, the biggest house you could afford, house prices kept rising. If you were a bank, you leveraged yourself up. And the more you leveraged, the more profit you made, and so on down the line. It became all the indications were that borrowing was a good thing to do. And the people making decisions became increasingly relaxed about debt. This is, if you take the long view, this happens repeatedly in history. It's roughly, not exactly, but it's roughly, it takes about 2 generations for people to completely forget danger. You always want to think, actually, when people talk about the financial market and what does the financial market think, it's always helpful to remember that a large part of the financial market is 28-year-old guys making trades who know no history, don't know anything. There may be some old guys around the office warning them, but who cares what they think? And so the market becomes increasingly casual. Then comes a point when people start to realize that maybe this debt is dangerous after all. House prices start to come down, and people say, "Oh, people have bigger mortgages than they can really afford to pay." Banks start to run into difficulties, and people start to notice that they have almost no capital. And at that point, you have deleveraging. You have a situation where basically everyone tries to cut back. Everyone tries to pay down debt. Everyone tries to spend less, save more. What's the problem? The problem is that the economy is a closed circle. You take the world as a whole, and even if you take any large individual economy, like the United States or like the European Union, then pretty much it is a closed circle. My spending is your income. Your spending is my income. If I decide that I must spend less, and you decide that you must spend less, and we do it at the same time, we have a problem, because both of our incomes fall. And we end up in worse shape than we were before. And what happened here was that everybody decided to spend less at the same time. Not everybody, but effectively. households in the United States, households in Spain, households in Britain, businesses in Western Europe and in the United States, and to an important extent governments, both sides as well. It's not people sometimes think of this as a crisis that started in the United States or started, whatever. It doesn't matter. The sequence is not very important. Yes, the first thing to go was U.S. housing, but the rest of it was waiting to happen. If you look at the fundamentals, Spain and Florida, the nation of Spain and the state of Florida look the same. Both are warm places with lots of coastal development, lots of holiday homes, crazy housing bubbles, way too much debt, crash, pretty much in the same way. The details are different, doesn't matter very much. Same thing. And I think actually in some ways this tells you that it was not the fault of anyone in particular. Since so many places, so many countries had more or less the same crisis, this is really a story of people forgot the past. And when you forget the past, you end up repeating the mistakes of the past. And so we had this crisis. Question is, what do you do? We have a normal way of dealing with a downturn in the economy. And the way we deal with it, the simple technical answer, involves the central bank. The central bank, whether it's the Federal Reserve or the Bank of Japan or the European Central Bank, cuts interest rates. And we did that. It was done more aggressively in the United States. So this is the federal funds rate. It's the equivalent in the United States of the repo rate, more or less, which is what the European Central Bank cut last week, if you were, for those of you following these things. Problem, right? You can see those gray bars are recessions in the United States. And each time we've had a recession, we cut rates, and the Fed keeps cutting until the economy recovers. And this time, it cut, and it ran into a problem, which is that you cannot cut the rate below zero. And zero is not low enough when you have a crisis as big as the one we had. Interestingly, small personal aside, we have seen this thing before. We've seen this problem before. We saw it in the 1930s, and then we saw it again beginning in the 1990s in Japan. And some people worried about that example. Right? Many people looked at Japan and said, oh, the Japanese, they have special problems. The rest of us are nothing like Japan. But a few people looked at Japan and said, Japan fundamentally is not that different from the United States or Europe. It's an advanced economy, stable government, policymakers who may not be ideal, but who are not complete idiots. So if the Japanese can get into this kind of problem, it could happen to us. I went to Princeton University in the year 2000, partly to work with people who, like myself, were worried about Japan. People who thought that the Japanese example was an omen, that Japan was a warning about what might happen even in the United States. That group of people is all dispersed now, except for me. But there are economists here. You may know the name of Michael Woodford, who's a very important, but he's not a household name, obviously, but very important monetary theorist. Lars Svensson, who went back to Sweden and has been at their central bank arguing with his colleagues all along. Of course, myself. There was a fourth guy. What was his name? Can't remember. Bernanke. Ben Bernanke was the last of the group. And we were all worried about Japan. And sure enough, turned out that we were just like Japan. That we had exactly the same kind of problem they had. The details are a little different. Japan had this, they had too much borrowing by corporations, we had too much borrowing by families, but the ultimate thing was the same. Okay, so what do you do in a situation like that? Well, really, there are a couple of options. One of them is if the private sector, if everyone in the private sector is trying to spend less at the same time, then we have a problem. Then the economy wants to have a depression. What can you do about it? You can have the public sector step in. You can have increased government spending, not permanently, but temporarily to support the economy. That's one possibility. That's fiscal policy. The other thing you can do, which is tough, is to do monetary policy. Have the central bank do something different. Central bank can buy unusual assets, longer-term debt. It can try to convince people that it will keep rates low. It can even try to convince people that it will accept an eventual rise in inflation. That's also something to be done. Those are the things we should have been doing. We did them a little bit, but not for long or not on a sufficient scale. Instead, we ran into really bad ideas. Well, what can I tell you? One of those ideas was the notion that actually, instead of increasing government spending, you should cut it. That's expansionary austerity. The view was that you would increase confidence by cutting government spending, and that would actually help the economy. That was very, very popular as a theory, particularly in Europe, although it's also popular with some people in the United States. Secondly, there was a panic about debt and deficit. And there's also been continuous panic about inflation. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. So, at this point, I could go on. I could go on about how we messed up in the United States. And we really did. But that's Europe even worse. So let's talk about Europe. So, just a measure. It's jargon, right? Structural primary balance. This is it's basically a measure of what the budget balance would be if the economy were recovered, if it were at normal employment. So it's kind of a measure of the fiscal stance. It's mostly reflecting changes in government spending. And primary just means without interest rates. Never mind. The thing is, when you have a depressed economy, you want this thing to go down. You want to run a deficit so as to support the economy. Not forever, but temporarily, while the private sector restores its balance sheet, while the private sector gets ready to spend again. And so if you have an economy that is deeply depressed with interest rates already very low, you want this thing to move in a major negative direction. Well, Europe did some of that. So this is for the euro area. You can see it in 2008, 2009, some. Not nearly enough not nearly enough given the scale of the shock. And it's always worth remembering when people try to talk about history that the financial crisis that we experienced in 2008 was a once in 3 generations crisis. No, it was not it was a 75-year flood. It was, if you look at the actual collapse in stock prices, the collapse in trade, it was every bit as bad as what happened at the beginning of the 1930s. This was the big one. This was when you should throw all of your normal notions of what kind of response is needed. You should put those aside and respond much more forcefully. We didn't do that. And then, if you notice, after 2010, something else happened, which was that policy began moving in exactly the wrong direction. That governments started pulling back, spending much less. That they began, and also raising taxes. Those spending cuts were the main thing. And I'm thinking about this now. Just think about Europe as a whole. If Europe were a country, you would look at this and say, this is crazy. This is completely insane. Now, for the U.S., by the way, it looks similar, though not as bad. And for the U.S., it is, in fact. It's completely insane that we're doing this. In Europe, it is to some extent crazy, but it's also a problem of the structure of Europe. The problem of Europe not really being ready for this crisis. Okay, so what happens? I'll come back to that one actually. This is a picture I like to point to. I think this explains a lot of what happened and also a lot of the misinterpretation. So this is late last year. The horizontal axis is the ratio of public sector debt to GDP, a measure of how deep in debt you are. The vertical axis is the interest rate on 10-year bonds, the measure of how much the financial markets were demanding from you. And ignore the separation for a moment. You see that for the most part it looks as if countries with high debt had big problems. I know many people probably know about that point in the lower right. That is Japan. And if you just look at the point, you say, there's something very strange about Japan. How can they have debt that's more than 200% of GDP and still have very low borrowing costs? But of course, if you look at it, instead, as I've done it, where I've differentiated between Euro and non-Euro countries, you see that actually, for countries that are not on the Euro, they all have low interest rates, no matter how much debt they have. Japan has low interest rates. The United States has low interest rates. Britain has low interest rates. Australia has low interest rates. It's only for countries that are on the Euro that debt seems to be a real problem. Okay. Two things. First, when debt started to be a real problem, first in Greece and then elsewhere, panic throughout the Western world. Policymakers, politicians said, oh my God, we're going to be Greece tomorrow. We have to stop spending, we have to reduce the budget deficit, never mind the unemployed, it's all about not becoming Greece. And so the fear of becoming Greece became a dominant theme of policy everywhere. It drove, if you look at the government of Britain, gave up on trying to boost the economy and turned to austerity because they said, if we don't, we'll turn into Greece. In the United States, more complicated, more voices on the other side, but a substantial part of our political process said, oh, we have to stop worrying about jobs because the most important thing is not to become Greece. And so on down the line. Interestingly, the only people who didn't seem to worry about becoming Greece were the Japanese, who already knew from long experience that they could have a lot of debt without a crisis. Become clear now that really you don't have to worry about becoming Greece if you have your own currency and if you borrow in your own currency. It just doesn't happen. The problems of debt are very much associated with pretty much being on the euro, or I have to say borrowing a lot in euros. So if you look at countries around in Eastern Europe, some of them have retained independence. Some of them are very much caught up on the crisis, even if they're not on the euro. And it's very much the question is whether they borrow a lot in euros. So if you look at, I have to say, I can't do Bulgaria. Probably safe to say that because I'll get in trouble. Turns out it'll always turn out somebody knows more. But I've looked a fair bit at two countries, at Hungary and Poland. And Poland has slid through this crisis with no trouble at all, and it's done so because the zloty is an independent currency, and because Poland hasn't borrowed very much in other currencies. Hungary has its own currency, but unfortunately has massive borrowing, private sector borrowing in other currencies, euros, even Swiss francs. So that's different. But someplace like the United States, or Canada, or Britain, or Japan doesn't have this problem. Why has the euro been such a problem? Well, here's where we come to the issue about Europe not being ready for the single currency. So let me tell you great, I think, illustrative example. In a way, the core of the issue. And the reason, so if you really, really want to understand why Europe is in trouble now, think of a comparison I already gave you, which is Spain and Florida, which, as I said, look very similar. By the way, by the numbers, it turns out that Ireland and Nevada also look very similar. They don't actually look very similar if you look at the scenery, but they are. But anyway, Spain and Florida is, I think, a very good comparison. Both Spain and Florida had enormous housing booms during the last decade. House prices went wild. They went wild in Malaga. They went wild in Miami. They went huge borrowing. People went deep into debt. Massive busts, foreclosures, disastrous problems. Florida is not in anything like the kinds of trouble Spain is in. So why is that? Well, part of the answer is that Americans are very mobile. So when the job market in Florida worsens, people move to other places. This remains true. The Single European Act means that legally people are free to move anywhere, but language barriers are still an issue. People in Europe are not that mobile. But much more important is the fact that the United States has a government, and Europe does not. This means a whole bunch of things. It means that when the Florida economy took a big downturn, pensions were not a concern because the main pension system in the United States, Social Security, is paid for by the federal government in Washington. Paying for health care was not a concern because for the elderly, and there are a lot of old people in Florida, health care is paid for by Medicare, which is a federal program paid for by Washington. Banks, a lot of trouble with banks, but bank deposits in the United States are guaranteed by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, based in Washington. And many of the loans that went bad were in fact owed to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are federal agencies based in Washington. So all of these losses fell not on the government of Florida, but on the national government. It's as if Brussels was paying for Spanish pensions, Spanish health care, rescuing Spanish banks. It goes on. Unemployment benefits. Big increase in unemployment payments, mostly paid for in Florida from Washington. Increase in other emergency programs, food stamps, paid for. You get the picture, right? If you look at it all together, you discover that during the crisis, Florida received, in effect, just aid from the U.S. government that amounted to around 6% of GDP. Not loans, just aid, just gifts. Not because anyone in Washington said, let's help out the people in Florida, but because we had a system that automatically supports a region that's in trouble. Try to imagine doing that here. By here, I mean Europe, right? Just imagine that you went to the German public and said to them, let's give Spain massive, massive aid with no strings attached, no conditions, right? Inconceivable, right? I mean, the Germans are practically going wild already with the relatively small amount of help that's being given. And this turns out to be essential. The United States can manage vast economy with one currency. We can manage very largely because we have a government that takes care of it. And this is not because we are better people. It's because of history. Because we settled the issue of whether we were really one country 150 years ago, and Europe has not really done that yet. So this has been a really huge problem. And what it has meant is that the parts of Europe that had big housing bubbles, that had big expansion, had been forced into extreme budget cuts. And anyone who thought that cutting your spending would help the economy by increasing confidence has found out that is absolutely totally not true. The bigger the budget cuts, I'm not even going to. This is just actually saying the bottom axis is the change in government spending since 2007. The vertical is the change in GDP. You can see all of those countries: Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Italy. Spain actually is only on that route. They've suffered terribly. Terrible decline. Okay. What can you do? Let me say, what do we want? What should a well-intentioned person from either Europe or the United States want to see happen to Europe? I think the answer is you do not want the euro to fail. How can I say this? The euro was a mistake. This currency should not have been created now. Someone should have burst into the room in 1992 when they were signing the treaty, the Maastricht Treaty, and said, stop, don't do this. Actually, some of us more or less tried to do that. You're not ready for this. Eventually, but not yet. But okay, that didn't happen. Now, for the euro to fail would be a disaster. It's a big difference between never doing it and having it fail once you started. If you allowed the euro to fail, now there'd be a lot of financial disruption. But that's actually, in a way, the least of it. The most important thing is it would be a failure for the European idea. I think I tried to say this at the beginning. I believe in the European idea of democracy, of peace, of growing union, of making this Europe maybe not a single country, but certainly a group of countries unified in spirit and in policies. For the euro to fail, you would have stepped back. You would have basically undone generations of attempts at progress. But very, very difficult to save it. So what are the things you can do? The first thing you can do is try to control panic. So we've had two near-death experiences for the euro, by the way, since in the last 2 years. We had one near collapse in late 2011 and a second near collapse in the summer of 2012. Both of them were resolved, at least temporarily, by good leadership. So I'm not totally critical here. So some people think I criticize all economists. Actually, I'm very sympathetic to economists that I went to graduate school with. And it turns out that everyone, I went to graduate school with everyone. Just happened to be that in the mid-1970s, everyone went to MIT. So Bernanke was there, Lawrence Summers was there, and there was another guy, pretty quiet guy, Italian guy, named Mario Draghi, who also was in grad school with me. So Draghi is terrific. We'll see whether he's good enough, but he's been brilliant, not so much on the economics as on the way he's managed to handle things politically and diplomatically. So, spread against Germany. Simple. The difference between interest rates, and these are the two countries that matter, right? Sad to say, we can lose Greece, we can lose Portugal. Those would be tragedies, but what really matters is Spain and Italy. If either of those drops out of the euro, then the euro has failed, and the European project has suffered a terrible defeat. So we have to worry about Spain and Italy. Late 2011, yields were shooting up. Banks were threatened with failure because they owned so much debt of these countries. It could have been really bad. What was really critical was that the European Central Bank stepped in to buy government debt to avoid a panic. The real danger you have in Europe now, the most immediate thing that can happen is what people sometimes call a doom loop, where people lose confidence in, let's say, Spanish bonds, price of Spanish bonds drop, Spanish banks get into trouble. That means they can't buy Spanish bonds, the price drops even more, and that was happening in late 2011. The board of the European Central Bank was dead set against buying Spanish and Italian bonds. So what Draghi did, he said, we will not buy Spanish or Italian bonds. However, we will lend unlimited amounts to banks using Spanish and Italian bonds as collateral. That was LTRO, long-term repurchase, whatever, which was doing it through the back door. Yield came down, the euro was saved for the moment. Not enough. Started to go even worse the summer of last year. At that point, Draghi made the famous remark, we will do whatever it takes. Which was interpreted that the European Central Bank would in fact buy debt if necessary which was then formalized. It hasn't actually done it, but it said it will, and again, to say. So this is actually the first step. This is the minimum that you must do to save the euro. You have to step in there to prevent panic. And so far, finally, the European Central Bank has stepped in. So that's good. We're a little bit closer to possibly saving this thing. But it's not enough. You're still left with the very difficult problem of resolving the imbalances in the system. Too much here. But I thought I'd just put it, you know what? You can read it. Let me just say it in less, more vaguely. What happened in Europe was that you have this period of great optimism when money flowed into the countries of southern Europe because people thought they were safe. They thought, Greece is now on the euro. What can go wrong? Spain is now on the euro. What can go wrong? All this money flooded into these countries. They boomed. They had inflation. And they became increasingly uncompetitive. And then the money stopped. And now they have to become competitive again. How do they do that? If they had their own currencies, they would devalue, but they don't. One way or another, their costs, their prices have to fall compared with Germany. And there's two ways that can happen. You can have Germany has some inflation while Spain doesn't, in which case Spain becomes relatively cheaper and Spain becomes competitive. Or you can have Germany has no inflation and Spain has deflation, has falling prices. That second option is much, much harder, much, much worse. For one thing, deflation brings depression. For another, deflation makes your debt problem worse because you have a falling income and the same debt. So you must prefer it to take place through German inflation rather than Spanish deflation. The trouble is, two things. One, the Germans don't like inflation for themselves. Second, if Germany has inflation, then Europe as a whole is going to have some inflation, though not as much. So what you really need is moderate inflation. The European outlook looks way better if you have 3% inflation than if you have 1% or 0% inflation. It's just, this is terribly, terribly important if you're going to be able to make this thing work. But there happens to be a really good example of how inflation in your trading partners can really help. And it's an example that the Germans never talk about because it's themselves. So people don't remember this, but in the late 1990s, Germany was a very depressed economy. They had found themselves somewhat uncompetitive, partly because of the expense of rescuing East Germany. Their economy was sluggish, employment was bad, lots of people were talking about German stagnation. Then they had a great recovery. The recovery involved moving into trade surplus, becoming competitive. How did they do that? This is how they did it. Core inflation, that means taking out food and energy that fluctuates. Germany did it by having low inflation while Southern Europe had pretty substantial inflation. And during that period, as a result, Germany became more and more competitive, moved into surplus, and good stuff, right? Okay. The trouble is, now the roles are reversed, and Germany does not want to return the favor. Well, what I would say, put it this way, my example was that European outlook is fairly manageable if the Eurozone has 3% inflation. Very, very hard to see a way out if it has 1% inflation or less. Latest numbers from the European Commission. You want to look at the last column. Do I have a pointer right here? I probably do. Yes. That number there. That's 0.8. That's the number you really want to look at. That is core inflation for the Eurozone. It is now 0.8%. That's disaster. That's a picture of the euro failing. Maybe not right away, maybe not instantly. One thing that's been truly impressive has been the willingness of European politicians and European citizens to suffer a great deal to try to make this thing work. I think if you had told most people, if you told economists, political analysts, what the economic situation in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, in Portugal would be right now, they would have said, oh, we would long since, they would have dropped out of the euro, you would have had a takeover of their governments by extremist parties. Well, you can see that the extremist parties are certainly gaining in strength, but the commitment to the European idea has been very, very strong, but it's not permanent. And if you're going to have this kind of outlook, it's not going to work. So what does it take now? Well, Draghi cut interest rates last week. That's not a lot because they're already very low. It was a signature, though, signal that maybe he's willing to do more. Maybe he's willing to do this. But of course, you can only do it if you can get approval. And so we have, and it's very troubling that it was a divided vote. And that there's so much negative talk in Germany about what's going on. What happens now? We don't know, right? I think we can see our way to making this thing work. I think it can be done, but it's going to require some. So far, the story of Europe has been one of enormous sacrifice on the part of the debtor countries. Enormous sacrifice on the part of Spain, Portugal, Greece. To save it now is going to require some sacrifice, not of a funny kind, some sacrifice on the part of Germany and the northern countries. Not really that they sacrifice money, but that they sacrifice their prejudices. That they'd be willing to say, hey, maybe a little inflation is not such a terrible thing. Maybe lending money in a financial emergency is not such a terrible thing. And the whole world is waiting to see whether they're willing to do that. I hope it works. Because in the end, what can I say? I sound a little bit like John F. Kennedy. I am a European. I'm not, obviously, but I care about it. This is one of the noblest things in the world, this European experiment. But to make it succeed, you have to get the technical details right. And this is not getting them right. This is what we have to solve now. Thank you.
Let's take our applause as a big thank you for the very analytical and fruitful lecture. I would say also very provocative. So I hope in a little while when we will start the Q&A session there will be a very interesting question on the basis of what we have heard. Let me now tell all of you, as you know, that since 1920, when was opened the Free University for Political and Economic Sciences, whose successor is the University of National and World Economy, there is a golden book of our university. For nearly a century, on the pages of this golden book, our eminent guests have addressed their epistles for the academic community. We have time just before a lecture having the coffee in my study with Professor Krugman to put his epistle to us. So now I'll ask him to read it in front of you. Yes, sure.
Let me say, I just realized I was flirting with disaster here with a bottle of water on top of the golden book. At least it wasn't coffee, but anyway, all right. My epistle here is I think in tune with with what I was saying. So it's a great honor to be given this degree. Now I wish your university, your nation, and Europe, of which you are now fully part, the best of futures. Democracy, prosperity, decency, may they continue their forward march past today's difficulties. Again, this is a great honor, and to visit a place with, in the end, so much hope fills me with gratitude. Thank you.
Having done all this, I have to assure Professor Paul Krugman that he is already a member of our academic family. And you should know, Paul, that as an UNWE Doctor Honoris Causa, you have the right and obligation to present an academic speech every year. And now, dear colleagues and friends, the floor is open for questions. I'll ask everybody asking the question to present him or her. Finally, you may come here.
Is this working? Yes, it is. Your acoustics are also very good. Dear Professor, I should correct you on something. At the beginning of your speech, you said that it's an honor for you for being in this new part of Europe. Actually, this is one of the oldest parts of Europe, and North Europe, as you know it, is much, much younger. In terms of economic development, yes, we are a little behind, but for many and complicated reasons. Straight to my questions. In the period of 2008 and 2013, according to the latest IMF data, published in October 2013, public debt to GDP ratio rose by 1/3 in Japan and the Eurozone, by 2/3 in the US, and it has doubled in the UK. Actually, as you noted, we have very sluggish recovery. Jobs market is gloomy and very bad. Obviously, pouring billions and trillions in these economies is not too effective, or otherwise said, it's supposed that we are getting better results. And my question is, can this pattern be changed, switching the deficit-driven recovery with the process of internal devaluation and restructuring ailing economic sectors? A second sub-question related to the first one. Does cheap financing of deficit and debt, the cost of the asset purchases of central banks, prevent policymakers from reforming the economy and bringing it back to hefty growth levels? And one more question. The deficit and debt-driven recovery is connected to the first one. Don't laugh at me. by deficit and debt-driven recovery in just mentioned countries, aren't we going to emulate the Japanese-style recovery in the 90s till now? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
They're so much related.
So, I respectfully disagree with basically everything just said, so as you might guess. So, first of all, the evidence that spending more rather than less helps short-term economic growth is overwhelming. You have to really torture yourself on the data to come up with any other conclusion. It's I could pull up my slide again, but the overwhelming evidence has been that the more countries contract their public spending, the worse their depression is. So if you're trying to say that the multiplier is zero, you're flying in the face of as good a test as we will ever have. Yes, public debt has increased. That's because we have an ethical crisis of the private sector. The public sector has to spend more if we were not going to have a full-out replay of the Great Depression. The notion that the easy money is a bad thing. First of all, you say, well, this encourages debt on the part of the private sector. Well, it encourages spending on the part of the private sector, and somebody has to spend. I mean, this is the arithmetic. I mean, not everyone agrees with that arithmetic. I believe, as best I can understand it, that Germany believes that everyone should be like them, and we should all run large trade surpluses. But it's, obviously that's not possible. Someone must spend. So if you are upset that low interest rates are encouraging spending, then you have to ask, what is it that you think should be happening instead? The last point, and I think that this is quite important, and you are expressing a view that is very widely held, which is that the key to recovery is reforms. Structural reform is what we need. I think one needs to be able to hold in your mind two opposing, two things that may sound like opposing views, but are not. One is that structural reform is a good thing. If you have structural problems, by all means, you should fix them, and they can help longer-term economic growth. The other is that structural reform has nothing to do with a problem that is basically the result of inadequate demand. That you can reform yourself up and down, and that may do nothing at all. It's not the heart of the problem. Let me give you two examples. Long answer, but it was a long question. Suppose you had asked in the year 1929 which economy in the world was structurally the strongest, had the most efficient private sector, the most dynamic market, the best entrepreneurship. It would surely have been the United States. And yet the United States, of course, had a terrible Great Depression. And in fact, the United States did worse in the first 4 years of that depression than most parts of Europe, with the exception of Germany. So the fact of being structurally sound doesn't protect you against this. It's not the same thing. It doesn't protect you against this kind of problem. If you had asked people in the year 2006 which European economy had been most successful at structural reforms, had made great strides, there was pretty much universal agreement. It was Ireland. In fact, George Osborne, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, gave a speech in 2006 where he praised Ireland as a shining example of long-term economic policy. That did not do the Irish very much good when their property bubble collapsed and they went into a slump. And even now, I mean, Ireland has been declared a country that is recovering, as best I can make out, 3 times so far, and they still have very high unemployment. So the structural reform thing is I believe a dangerous diversion. It's confusing 2 different kinds of problems. If you ask, it can get you very, very badly off track when we talk about the kinds of problems that are central right now.
Thank you for your reply.
Professor Krugman. Somebody else for questions? No more than 3.
I think you need to be closer to the microphone.
It's an honor, first of all, to have you here, and I believe I would speak on behalf of everyone by thanking you for this compelling lecture. You raised a lot of issues. If I may, I would like to add another one about the fiscal side of things. Yes, we brushed on this probably. You talked about Florida, for example, where automatic mechanisms have been able to counter the effects of recession. We haven't seen this in many countries in Eastern Europe, specifically the non-Europe countries.
Right.
Some of them have expanded government spending, and haven't been able to achieve growth. Some of them have been able to support the economy. Some of them have maintained the European criterion of 3% government deficit, for example, like Estonia, for example, and they have been able to return to growth faster. So, which would you suggest as a better option? What's your view on this?
Okay, so I'm not sure if everyone could hear that. The question was, what are the options of policy in Eastern Europe with a wide variety of experience? And I will say that it is not, it's not an easy question because there are, we are talking about nations that are at various stages of development. And I'll give you my, where I come at this is actually mostly from the experience of a different part of the world, which is Latin America. And in Latin America, we have had repeated crises. It has turned out, historically, it has been the case that the Latin American nations have not been able to pursue independent monetary policies or independent fiscal policies because they had debt that was in dollars, because they were fiscally insecure. There's actually a famous analysis by Guillermo Calvo called Fear of Floating, which explains the great difficulties of Latin America. And you can very much see that syndrome in much of Eastern Europe. There is a process of graduation. As countries become more advanced, more sophisticated, and have more developed financial markets, they begin to achieve more autonomy. In Latin America, you can actually see this. We had I came here straight from a research conference at the International Monetary Fund, where there were an excellent paper on how Latin America has changed. This time around, Latin America sailed through the crisis with relatively little damage. It was able to pursue counter-cyclical fiscal policy for the first time ever. It was able to expand instead of contracting because the economies have become more mature and because they've been run prudently up to this point. My read on this is that Poland is at that point. Poland in a way has looked like Brazil or Mexico in this crisis, relatively able to cope. Most of the rest of Eastern Europe, quite clearly, the financial markets are poorly developed. Borrowing is largely in euros or other currencies. The fiscal credibility is not high. And also, of course, very poor countries, Latvia, are very concerned at maintaining their path towards becoming fully a part of Europe, and they want they fear that a devaluation would endanger that path. And then, I mean, of course, Estonia is one of the success stories, which is partially. I think the main thing to say is it's a very small place, and essentially one new large factory relocated from Finland to Estonia can have a very significant impact on the growth rate. So you really need to have some perspective there. But and we've had a large discussion. Latvia has been very extensively studied. We actually had a session, another discussion, paper by Olivier Blanchard, the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, all about Latvia, with me as the discussant. And there was some discussion. We are devoting an hour and a half of a high-level economics meeting to the economy of a country with the same population as Brooklyn. But Latvia is an interesting story, but it turns out to be very unusual and also very not easy to interpret. So what I would say is that it's very much case by case. Would I have recommended that Bulgaria try to emulate Poland? I don't think so. I think you're not ready for that. I think Bulgaria, unfortunately, looks like a Latin American country in the 1980s with much less freedom of action at this point. But move forward, and hopefully by 10 years from now, the euro will be a much better system, and I would be able to wholeheartedly recommend that people adopt it. Right now, I understand that in Poland they're talking about going on the euro, which I think is insane. They have something that works for them, and this would be a terrible mistake. But it's a difficult thing. I should say it's not currency policy. Currency policy is easy if you are an advanced country with its own currency and a long reputation of credibility. It's not easy for countries like Eastern Europe, which is I know this is an ancient civilization here, but in terms of the modern system, it's a new part of Europe.
Thank you, sir. Other questions? You have the floor. Elena Simeonova, Department of Sociology.
Professor Krugman, thank you for your insightful lecture. My question is very short and much easier than previous one. Explaining what happened to Europe, you mentioned one of the reasons is the bad responses given from the EU to the crisis, and these bad responses, according to you, were based on that economic analysis. So my question is, what is your recipe for a good economic analysis, especially in time of crisis?
Okay. I'm clear. Do you mean what is the right analysis, or who should we go to for the analysis?
What is the right analysis, and who should make this analysis?
Okay.
What should we look for in this analysis?
Okay. So I would say the right analysis is basically, how can I say this? This is, it has been remarkable to me how well a relatively traditional Keynesian economic analysis has worked. If you learn your economics from a sophisticated but still relatively traditional Keynesian view of fiscal and monetary policy. If you, for the economists here, basically IFLM, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, sorry, but IFLM has worked remarkably well through this crisis, and the international, the open economy version of it, more jargon, Mundell-Fleming, has worked very well in the crisis. It has been, there have been very few, let's put it this way, everyone who's asserted that some fundamental tenet of that traditional view doesn't work, that contractionary fiscal policy is actually expansionary, or that high levels of debt change everything, has gotten it wrong. And people who stayed with that basic analysis have been relatively right. In terms of who you should turn to, I think you want to look for, as far as possible, for not just for people and institutions that are smart, but also for ones that don't have a mixed agenda, that are not trying to achieve something else. That there's been way too much attempt to exploit the economic crisis to achieve essentially political goals that have nothing to do with the crisis. And that's the true, very much, you know, it's the true everywhere, it's the true in the United States. If you were to look at what's been happening within Europe, what I would say, we have of course, the Troika has been dictating policy to a large extent, and it's, which is the European Commission, the ECB, and the International Monetary Fund. And the Commission has very clearly had a political agenda. It has been trying to push structural reforms, what it thinks is right, which may have nothing to do with the crisis, under the guise of crisis management. The European Central Bank, I'm sorry to say, has been kind of that way as well. Rather surprisingly, given history, it's been fairly clear that the International Monetary Fund is the least political member of the Troika, the most open-minded, and they've been the good guys. So if you wanted a simple answer who to listen to, at least at the moment, is listen to the IMF, or actually, most specifically listen to another one of my classmates, Olivier Blanchard, was the chief economist of the IMF, and who I'm happy to say appears to have Christine Lagarde's ears as well. I kind of find some economists I like that I did not go to school with, but it's kind of hard.
Do we have other questions?
Mr. Krugman.
We'll go ask the mic for the audience.
Okay, Mr. Krugman, last year you were in Moscow and you had a great discussion with President of Russia. What do you think about this discussion?
I actually can remember nothing of the substance.
Okay.
Actually, what I mostly remember is that I had a terrible cough. I was quite sick and coughing very loudly, and Mr. Putin made fun of my cough.
Some more questions?
My question is, what's your opinion on companies that are, so to say, too big to fail? What place do they have in an economy that's trying to recuperate from the crisis? Okay, yeah. So the question is about the too big to fail banks and or financial institutions. I have trying to phrase this the right way. In some ways, too big to fail. People know, right? The argument is that if you are Citigroup, then some enormous financial company, Royal Bank of Scotland, that you are. Everybody knows that the government will step in to prevent you from failing, and that this distorts incentives, leads to excessive risk taking, and so on. I do believe that as an economic matter, too big to fail has been given too much. If you look at the institutions that actually did the lending that caused the crisis, for the most part, they were not the biggest. Not saying, as happened, Citigroup was a bad player, but in the United States, still, most of the players that did the most damage were smaller. Lehman Brothers was not that big an institution, and yet it almost destroyed the world, right? And if we look in Europe, think about Spain, which is the epicenter of the crisis here. The big, bad lending was done not by Santander, which was actually quite responsible, but by the Cajas, which are relatively smaller banks. Actually, if we look in the United States, it turns out that the state within the United States has the highest rate of bank failure. The most irresponsible lending is the state of Georgia, not to be confused with the country, which has, as it happens, laws that have kept banks relatively small but highly irresponsible. I think there's a big political problem with giant institutions, which is that giant financial institutions have too much political power. They distort regulations. They make life too easy for themselves by basically being able to buy political influence. It's deeply disheartening to see how many officials in the United States, elsewhere too, actually, that people, top officials make policies, then they leave government and immediately they go to work for a giant financial institution. That's it's corruption of a soft kind. There's no explicit quid pro quo. There's no open bribery, but nonetheless it's highly inappropriate influence, and that is a big problem. The different issue is how do you regulate institutions that can endanger the system. They don't have to be giant. The biggest problem I think we have is that of regulating, particularly of regulating shadow banks, right? That's of regulating institutions that are not traditional banks, and it's very difficult to write rules for them. And yet, well, as we see, they can take on leverage. I'm having a moment here, but the AIG, Who would have, we had no system in place, and yet an institution like AIG was able to wreak enormous damage. The solution we have right now, insofar as we have one, in the United States, is we have legislation, Dodd-Frank, for financial regulation, which is actually discretionary. It has a council which designates financial institutions as strategically important, and then subjects those institutions it regards as strategically important to extra requirements in terms of capital, in terms of keeping down their leverage, which is something, but it's problematic because it requires that the regulators be smart and honest, and you can't always count on that. So it's a hard thing. So I would like to see the giant institutions broken up. I think that Citigroup is too big, not because necessarily that's where financial crises start, but because it has too much political influence. So I think that's the story. But I think there is a danger that thinking that solving too big to fail means that you solve the risk of crisis, and you haven't.
Mr. Kruгман, you mentioned the word regulation. What do you think the regulation makers have missed during the last year? Thank you.
Well, obviously, the regulators missed almost everything in the run-up to the crisis, right? They missed the rise of shadow banking. They missed the dangers of household leverage. They missed the danger of large. Within Europe, they missed the danger of large imbalances at the national level. Looking forward, I think my concern for I think Europe is actually well behind. Europe has done very little in terms of actually improving regulations to deal with the 21st century. The United States has a law which is not stupid, again, Dodd-Frank. Not stupid is a high term of praise when it comes to legislation. But I think I worry because it really depends. It depends upon having high quality government officials, which you can't always count on. I think the biggest gap in almost everybody's regulation is that we aren't looking enough at the dangers of non-bank balance sheets. Maybe obscure here. In the United States, the banking, we control the banking crisis. The banks have been rescued, they've been made, capital, liquidity is available, risk premia are way down, money is flowing freely, and yet the economy remains depressed. And probably the biggest reason the economy remains depressed is that households are still too deep in debt. So there should have been regulations that would discourage households from over-borrowing. And there are actually examples of that, and they come in strange places. So one of the surprise success stories of financial regulation in the United States comes from, of all places, the state of Texas. Right? You all have an idea of Texas, right? It's crazy right-wing, it's cowboys, they free market and all of that, all of which is true. However, they have a very old law in Texas that limits borrowing by, basically means that you cannot take out a second mortgage on your house. You cannot extract home equity in Texas. The very old law comes from 3 generations ago, when Texas was politically a very different kind of place. But one result of that has been that there have been many fewer bankruptcies in Texas, much less of a crisis, because in effect Texas was, more or less by accident, regulating non-bank leverage. And that's something that we still have not done. We've done nothing at all about that anywhere, as far as I can make out. If you have to go, so that's a big hole. I would say that by and large, we have done very little to prevent the next crisis. The only thing that I think gives us some leeway is that at least people remember this crisis, and this will, to some extent, inhibit them from going crazy on the next one.
Other questions for enough teasing, Professor Krugman? No, we have more. Okay.
My name is Paulina, and I study international economic relations in my 3rd year. And having you today in our country, in this hall, I just can't help asking about, ask you to comment on the current situation in Bulgaria in terms of the social tension. As you know, we have 2 groups. The one is, I can refer to as the common people. I do not, different groups of people. And these social tensions have been common for many countries in Europe. And perhaps as a result of the crisis. And another group, the students, and this is the most current protest. What do you think about their ideas and the way they show the way they show their thoughts? Thank you.
Okay. So I was guessing I would be asked about that, and my problem is substantial ignorance. So I don't know enough to say very much. But let me say, I am actually extremely sympathetic to the protests throughout Europe. I believe that and by the way, the United States as well. So obviously we had our brief, the Occupy Wall Street phenomenon, and again, I was very sympathetic. We need those voices. We need, there was a plunge into an austerity orthodoxy, a view that the way forward necessarily involves nothing but cutting benefits, removing regulations, removing social protection. And that has been a cruel orthodoxy in many ways, and furthermore, it hasn't worked. So when people are preaching very harsh policies on the grounds that this is what you must do, and then they fail to deliver, even on the promise, then there should be protest. How exactly that plays out is it's hard to know in any country. But I think it's actually important that we have a how can I say this? The idea that everyone should shut up and listen to the wise people of Brussels or Frankfurt is definitely a bad one. Those wise people are not necessarily that wise, and democracy is not just about having elections; it's about having open discussion, and that can mean demonstrations, it can mean lots of noise. And sometimes that's how things are opened up. So the answer is, without having any useful comment on the specifics, I'm very sympathetic. I think that the people who demonstrate in Spain, in France, in Greece, deserve a proper hearing, because if you don't listen to them, then eventually you'll end up having something much worse. I'd very much rather have these protests and have them taken seriously than wake up one day and discover that we have something much closer to a replay of the 1930s than anyone wants to talk about right now.
Let's see some other questions. So, dear colleagues, there is another second reason for Professor Krugman being here, secret one. According to the UNWE Trustees Council decision, each member of the Council annually funds the publishing of a book in an own opinion, a book by Nobel winner or economist, famous public features, politicians, managers, representatives of the business, and write an introduction to it. So far, in this series, publications of the UNWE Trustees Council were published the books Freefall by Joseph Stiglitz, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, and Journey by Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister. The third book from the series is International Economics, Theory and Practice by Doktор Хонорис Кауза of UNWE, Professor Pol Krugman. Its publishing is financed by the member of the UNWE Trustees Council, Dr. Vasiliev, who is among us, who is also the author of the introduction. I am giving the floor to Dr. Vasiliev to share with us why he chose Professor Pol Krugman and why he chose exactly this book, International Economics, Theory and Politics. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Dear Professor Krugman, Dr. Honoris Kauza of University of National and World Economy Sofia, dear Professor Statis, dear Professor Borisov, dear students and professors, ladies and gentlemen, this is the surprise which we did as a continuation of our initiative as Board of Trustees. I think our edition can compete with the original, isn't it, Professor? So, when I had to decide who among the prominent economists shall become more accessible to our students and professors, I did not have any hesitation in choosing Professor Pol Krugman, being one of the most admired and influential economists of modern times, winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics for 2008, as well as the holder of many various prestigious awards of high distinction and merit. Far more difficult for me was to choose which one of Professor Krugman's more than 20 brilliant studies and best-selling books had to be translated and published by the university press in a continuation of this wonderful initiative which I already mentioned, which Board of Trustees, which I'm honored to be a member of. The choice of the 9th edition of International Economics, done by Professor Krugman and his colleagues, Professors Opsfeld and Mellis, was perhaps made emotionally by me, due to the fact that it covers my own background to a certain extent. Regardless of the emotional point in choosing this book, I do believe that the content of the book, which lays out the grounds of international economic theory, provides an exceptional foundation for the comprehension of the complex and controversial processes and phenomena within the spreading globalization and mutual interdependence of the national economy. The brilliantly structured content helps us deepen our knowledge of international trade policy and trade theory, along with international monetary and financial relations. Of course, the 9th edition of the International Economics is being updated, taking into account first the user's recommendations and second the significant development in both the theory and the practice of the international economic relations. The latter were shaped by the global economic crisis, which started back in August 2008 and which still determines the world economy agenda. The globalization in the last decade has reached new scales. The international trade has become more intensive. The technology process accelerates. The volume of international trade increases. The financial activity is getting greater. New leading markets have emerged, whereas that used to be strong have lost of their former influence. The economic history has changed along with the faith in the existing concept. New important questions have arisen. At the same time, clear conclusions have been drawn. At this current stage, the structure of global economy needs a solid ground consistent with value theories that function in real life and which can reveal the way out to the recovery of the global economy. We live in an extreme time which require in-depth analysis, brave action, and quick reactions and solutions. The 9th edition of the International Economy gives me the certainty that it provides to the maximum extent the modern academic society with local needs, being at the same time an exceptional use to the government, economic agents, students, and in general to all modern thinking people. This fact explains why I have chosen Professor Krugman's the International Economics, why I supported Bulgarian edition of this 9th edition of International Economics. So, thank you for the opportunity to work for this and to support this edition.
I want to say in front of this audience that the course of International Economics is in our general agenda and in all of the class of the specialties on a bachelor degree. So I hope that this book, International Economics, in some parts will be the beginning course, and in some parts will be used in our master degree courses. And saying this, I will pass the mic and the floor to Professor Krugman to say a few words how he feels published in Bulgarian.
Well, thank you. Obviously, I feel very honored and flattered. Although I should warn you that 10th edition is in production right now, so the book will be outmoded. Now we've updated. The fundamentals have not changed. And no, I mean this book has a history. It's well, the first edition was published before the fall of communism. First edition was 1988, and we've tried to keep up with it, tried to deal with it. I remember that when originally Maurice Opsfeld and I wrote it, and then we brought Mark Nellis in most recently. I remember we wrote about it when we did it, we said, boy, it's a very exciting time, 1980s in the international economy. It'll probably never be this exciting and difficult again. So we're catch the wave right now. And of course, it keeps on getting more and more exciting and more difficult with each successive edition. Very glad to see you do this. We do live in a time of extraordinary events on the financial side and extraordinary events on the real side too. We live in an era of hyper-globalization, of more trade now, more interaction than ever before. And I hope that this book in Bulgarian helps your students to understand something about this world in which we now live. Thank you so much for the honor of translating it.
Dear colleagues and friends, thank all of you for participating in the academic ceremony on awarding the honorary title of Dr. Honoris Kauza of University of National and World Economy to Professor Pol Krugman. We are at the end of the